Hey, good morning, friends. How are you? Good to see you all. Pat yourselves on the back for being here on 4th of July weekend and during the Women's World Cup game. I'm looking to see if anyone's running for the door right now. I just realized that. So good to be with you all this morning. Hey, if you've been around for a while, you may remember that during the month of July, we changed things up a little bit. And it's a little bit of a time of respite and rest for a lot of our volunteers and staff. Oftentimes, attendance goes down a bit in summer with everyone traveling and the transient nature of the summer. And one of our favorite parts about all of this is that during the Sundays in July, we invite guest speakers, some local, some from across the country, across the world in some cases, folks who we've gotten to know, people we're inspired by. And I'm super excited because we have a really, really strong start in the month of July by inviting Britt Barron, who is a pastor. She's a leader, a writer, and a spiritual director. And I'm so inspired by her life, her work, and I'm so glad she's here to join us this morning to teach and share with us. So would you guys all welcome Britt Barron to the stage?
All right, well, good morning, everyone. How you doing? I will start off by saying I almost canceled when I found out that this was the same day that the World Cup final is going to be. So I just want to start this morning by letting you know that I'm a good person, and I decided to still come here. So I am from LA. Woo, any LA fans in the... All right, strong. Half of you are probably from LA. Come on, don't lie. Everyone I've met so far on this trip, I've been like, oh, you a Colorado native? They're like, no. Like, is anyone from here? I'm actually from here. I grew up in Aurora, Colorado. Anyone? Yes, a strong whoop for Aurora. One hand, okay. So it's good to be back. I still have my 303 number, which I'll never change. I feel like it gives me good Colorado street cred when I'm here. I'm like, yeah, I'm one of us. So I have heard that you all are going to be going through the book of Matthew this July. So I'm super grateful to be a part of this summer speaker series. I'm also grateful to go first because there's no standard. So as of right now, I'm the best guest speaker in July. So another props to me. Wow, okay. So this morning, we're going to be in the book of Matthew, chapter 5. So chapter 5, verse 17 through 20. If you want to grab a Bible or your phone, if you have an actual physical Bible, that's pretty wild for 2019. I'm going to read this off my phone. And I just have to change the window from when I was checking the score. Okay. This is important. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, it goes like this. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Just some strong, light, uplifting words from Jesus this morning. So before we get into this passage, I want to tell you all a story. One of my biggest passions in life is the American Civil Rights Movement. I love to study it. I love to understand it. I love to do my best to meet as many people who have been a part of it. So something I've gotten to do for the past 5 years was lead a civil rights tour that goes through the South, and we get to talk to people who are part of the movement. And this one woman that we got the opportunity to interview, her name is Dr. Gwen Patton. She lives in Montgomery, Alabama. And if you are familiar, Montgomery, Alabama is where the Montgomery bus boycott took place. So this is when buses were segregated. Black folks had to sit in the back. White folks had to sit in the front. And so eventually they boycotted the bus systems. And the boycott lasted for over a year. It was like 364 days, right? No, 65. What is a year? Yeah, over a year. Sorry, words are hard, numbers are hard. But it was over a year for sure. And so it was so organized So streets in Montgomery, Alabama, in black neighborhoods, they would have a system, and part of that system was something called a block leader, which meant if there was a person with a car in that neighborhood, they would get everyone's grocery list, their medicine list, their prescription list, and once a week they would go to the store with their car and deliver everything that they needed to make sure everyone was set. And so this woman, Dr. Gwen Patton, was a part of that movement, and she was a young 13 years old. Her parents were block leaders, and she was really involved. She went on to be a powerhouse in the movement, but that was sort of her start. And so she was telling us a story about the bus boycott when it ended. And she said, I was getting on the bus with my aunt after the boycott, which meant sit anywhere. And so she said her thing that she liked to do was she liked to get on the bus, sit as close to the front as she could, and find the person who she thought that would make them most uncomfortable, right? Which I'm like, yes. And so she says this one day, she gets on the bus, she does her thing, she finds the person sitting next to the front, she sits right next to him, and then she watches as her aunt, who is also a black woman, walks and sits in the back of the bus. So she's becoming furious on the bus ride. They got off the bus, and she looks at her aunt and says, how could you? We fought so hard to sit in the front of the bus, and how could you go and sit in the back? And her aunt very calmly said, oh, sweetie, I wasn't fighting to sit on the front of the bus. I was fighting so I could sit wherever I wanted, right? Burn. And she likes sitting in the back. And I think about that story all the time as my experience with my faith and my relationship with God has gone something like, here is the exact way that I have experienced God. Let me hand this to you so it can fit exactly your life. Does that sound familiar to anyone? That because one person or a few people in leadership decided that there was one way to connect or one right way to be a Christian or one right way to do things, we all got handed that instead of saying, no, what we're fighting for is that you can experience God however you experience God. And that is where we come to Jesus and Jesus' masterful teaching. And when Jesus teaches, he doesn't teach us what to think. Jesus teaches us how to think. It's not information. This is why Jesus uses so many parables. Because if you want to just give someone information, a parable is literally the worst way to do it, right? Like if you're just like, oh, that's a question? Okay, well, what if someone had 3 coins and someone had 5 coins and then they buried some of them? And you're like, what are you talking about, right? Because parables don't give information. They're an invitation into a conversation. They're an invitation for you to figure out what that means. It's an invitation to say, I don't know, maybe 2,000 years later, these things might mean something different in Denver in 2019 than they did in Jerusalem, and so I'm going to create some room for that. Because it's not just a set of rules, it's an invitation into a bigger conversation. And that's what I love about Jesus, and that's what I love about this passage. Is Jesus saying, hey, there's going to be Pharisees and teachers who are going to take this law and they might take it too far. That doesn't mean you throw it all out. That means I've already made accommodations for this. I'm already teaching you how to think, and people are going to tell you what to think, but don't worry, this book is still good, this thing is still good. And if you're anything like me, did anyone grow up in the church? Woo! Did anyone grow up in a church that believed a certain set of things that now you feel pretty far from? Yeah. And at some point, wasn't it kind of tempting to be like, I'm just going to get rid of this whole thing, right? At some point, it was so confusing to me to have to figure out how to navigate these things, and I thought I believed this, but this is also true, and I'm experiencing this, and I don't know what to do, so maybe I'll just get rid of the whole thing. And isn't it funny that so many of my answers for that were found in Scripture? And I love that, because that's the invitation that Jesus is giving. He's saying, don't throw it out. It's not about getting rid of these words I've said. All of these words are good. And there will be some people who take them too far, and we have to figure that out. At the end of this verse, Jesus talks about entering the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven, as described by Jesus, is where it's in our midst. And that transforms 100% of the way I think about things, because I used to think about things as sin management. My life was about sin management, right? Anyone else? It's like I just had to stay like a little like on the left of the line so that when I died, I would go up instead of down, and that was the whole point, right? And if that's the whole point, it really changes the way you live. But if the kingdom of heaven is in our midst, and Jesus is saying, there's a reality that you can participate with now, but you will not be able to see unless you listen to some of these words and these invitations that I'm giving you. Because in this upside down reality kingdom that Jesus was talking about, that he was bringing now and is bringing then and is bringing now, it looked a lot different than the society of the day. There was no hierarchy, no power structures in this kingdom. Everyone was welcome and everyone had a seat at the table, right? Which is so wild. Jesus was like, oh, are you a kid? Great. Are you a prostitute? Awesome. Tax collector? Yeah, come on. Pharisee? All right, I'll have dinner at your house, right? And everyone was welcome, and he created this beautiful narrative. And that's the same kind of gospel that we get invited to today. That Jesus looked at everyone around and said, divine, 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 divine. Not gay, straight, rich, poor, man, woman, Republican. What's the other one? Democrat, right? There's a lot of other ones now, but those are the big ones. But Jesus looks at everyone and says, divine, 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 divine. Christ in you, Christ in you, Christ in you, Christ in you. When we talk about entering the kingdom of heaven, it's not after you die, where are you going to go? It's that right now something is happening, and if you want to participate, then you have to put on a lens that says, Christ in you, Christ in you, Christ in you, Christ in you, divine, divine, divine. And that is amazing, and that is really hard to do. So I want to talk about another civil rights leader whom I love. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. His name's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the lesser-known activists. So you have Dr. King, and Dr. King is one of the greatest leaders in our country's history, one of the greatest leaders in modern history, and just this phenomenal man who led movements, who rallied thousands and thousands of people, who changed lives, who progressed policy, who won a Nobel Peace Prize, who had a direct line on the phone to the president. And this man, this leader, was in Memphis, Tennessee when he was killed. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis, Tennessee because he was organizing a rally and a march for sanitation workers in Memphis. So this Nobel Peace Prize winning direct line to the president leader gave his life saying, if I'm invited to the table but the sanitation workers in Memphis aren't, then I don't want to be there. That is what radical kingdom gospel looks like. But here's the great plot twist. If Dr. King or Dr. Patton or you or I don't believe that we have a seat at the table, it's going to be really hard to invite anyone else there. And as we go further in this book and Jesus starts saying words like, love your neighbor as yourself, here's the thing. That's only radical if you don't hate yourself. And you want to get to the point where you can love your enemy? Oh, that's going to take real work of loving the parts of you that look like them. Because just right now when I said enemy, like that person popped up in your head. I know it did. It's fine. Mine too. So there's this book. Are there any Enneagram fans in the house? Woo. I'm a strong Enneagram 7, which means I just hate anything sad. So I read this book called Into the Wild, which was my nightmare, because if you read that book, it ends very sad. And then it's over, right? There's not like any kind of uplifting thing. So I made up my own narrative of what might have happened after, just to make myself feel better. But there's this book called Into the Wild. So this guy goes on his own journey, his quest to find himself. And he does all these things, and he doesn't make it, which I don't feel bad ruining that for anyone. It came out a long time ago. I think it's a book and a movie, so if you haven't seen it, you missed your window. So he doesn't make it, but before he doesn't make it, he's sort of cataloging things in a journal. And at one point, he realizes this foundational truth that all of the joy or these moments that he experienced, they actually weren't real. And he writes these words that say, happiness is only real when shared, right? And you're like, oh. And I'm like, oh, that's so true, though. That happiness is only real when shared. Maybe the healing and the transformation and the wholeness and the maturity that we experience in Jesus is also only real when shared. And maybe the greatest prophet of our day, Brené Brown, is right when she says, my healing is inextricably tied to your healing, and our healing is inextricably tied to the healing of the world. In other words, if you want to be part of this kingdom reality that is happening right now, this upside-down thing where there's no hierarchy and you look and you see Christ in everyone, it's not going to happen if you can't see Christ in yourself. And it's not going to happen if you don't do your own work. And we're all good Christians in this room. So maybe it's no one, maybe it's just me, but I have definitely gone on a missions trip to avoid my own stuff. Or I've signed up for the service day, or I've done you name it, to be out there inviting people to something that I didn't think was even real for me. Because the reality is there were parts of myself that I didn't love. And whether or not you want to believe it, that shows up in the way you're going to love someone else. There's this author, Richard Rohr, who talks about the reality that Christ is in all of us. And if Christ is in all of us, there's also a reality that for some of us, Christ might be in the tomb and in need of a little resurrection. And that if we can begin to love the nuance in ourselves, and we can begin to love the parts of ourselves in which Christ is in the tomb and needs resurrection, then we might be able to look at someone else with a little more empathy and care and love. So I grew up I usually have to do so much setup for this story because no one's ever heard of Aurora, Colorado, but I forgot I'm in Colorado. So I grew up in Aurora, Colorado, ditched the 5 minutes of telling you where that is. And I went to Smoky Hill High School. Any Smoky Hill fans in the house? No, okay. Yeah, oh my gosh, all right. What a strange name for a high school. So I went to Smoky Hill. And in the year 2000, we had a principal. Her name was Dr. Jarvis. So Dr. Jarvis was this phenomenal woman. She was an amazing principal, and she was openly gay. And she was the only openly gay principal in the state of Colorado. And she was so magnificent and so wonderful. And so because of this, our school had the only LGBTQ student club in the district. And now I say LGBTQ student club because that's the language we have in 2019. But in 2000, would you all like to know what the club was called? Okay, it was called HEART. It had 2 H's, and it stood for Homosexual and Heterosexual Alliance Reaching for Tolerance. So that's where we were in the year 2000 in Aurora, Colorado. So because of that, I went to school with all kinds of people and a diverse group of friends. And I had this friend named Andrew, right? You're not here, are you, Andrew? This will be weird. Change his name for confidentiality. His name was Joe. That'll work. And he was gay, and you guys, he was out as a 14-year-old in Aurora, Colorado in the year 2000, okay? I didn't come out till I was 30 and I lived in LA, right? It took so much guts to be him. And so because I was in high school and because it was the year 2000 and because I was the worst, I said, that's so gay for everything, oh, your shoes are so gay, your haircut's gay. You know what I mean? That was the language of the time. And one day he sat me down and he said, hey, I don't think you mean it like this, but when you say that's so gay and the word gay is associated with something bad, it makes me feel bad. Which is the most compassionate, the most caring, the most graceful and empathetic way he could have come to me with that. And you know what I said? I said, stop being so gay about it. Plot twist. I was gay the whole time, right? 15 years later, I was like, oh, wow. But here's the reality, that there are parts of me that hate being confronted. There are parts of me that hate being called out. There are parts of me that will go to the grave saying I'm right when I know I'm wrong. And now, as a woman who's out and is 30, whatever, specifics aren't important, and I have a conversation where I graciously and empathetically and humbly come to someone about their language, and they blow me off. I have a different place inside myself that understands that in a different way, because I've been that. And there's this reality that we are not going to be able to sit with the Christ in someone else if we can't sit with the Christ in us, both the Christ who is resurrected and the Christ who is in the tomb. When I was growing up in the church, the story about humanity started in Genesis 3. I don't know if anyone can relate, but the story started and humans were bad. We were so bad, and God hated us so much that God's Son had to die just to keep God from killing us. When you say it like that, it's really wild, but that was the narrative, right? Anyone else? And then I start to realize, whoa, this book starts in Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, we are good, and we are loved, and God cares for us. And starting that story in Genesis 1 changes the way I see the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus on the cross is no longer feel bad for how bad they beat him up, because they beat him up because you're bad. I look at Jesus on the cross, and I'm like, look at that. Look at someone taking on all the oppression and taking on all the violence without becoming an oppressor and giving any violence in return. Watch someone confront all of the power structures and systems without accumulating any power for themselves. Watch someone navigate a world that is constantly drawing lines of who is good, who is bad, who is right, or who is wrong, and just looking out and saying, divine, 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 divine. I would die for all of you. And that may be the narrative of Jesus on the cross and the suffering Christ. Isn't that Christ had to die for us? But maybe it's that Christ suffered with us. And if Christ is suffering with us, then the Christ in us that's in the tomb, when we bring that to Jesus, we hear the most two powerful words in the English language. Me too. And if you can understand your own suffering and your own pain in a kind of way that doesn't turn you into the very thing that hurt you, then you can sit with someone else and say, me too. And if you can do that, then you can look at the Christ in the tomb in your enemy and take the most radical words of Jesus and say, I know what it's like to suffer. Because the reality is that hurt people, what? Hurt people. And transform people, what? Transform people. But in order to be a part of that, you have to do your own work. This is like a small shout out, it just feels perfect to just like shout out therapy. I don't know if anyone's a fan. Therapy fans, and yes. You guys, my therapist is here. I could cry. But there's a part of me, right? There is a very active part of me that hears the political rhetoric of the day, that hears what certain people say about people like me, black, queer woman. And there's a part of me that's like, you know what? And then all of a sudden, I hear my language, and it sounds exactly the same as theirs. I've just swapped out the pronouns. I'm like, damn, that can't be right, right? There's got to be a different way. There's got to be a different way. And the different way is this Jesus who's saying, don't throw out this book because your youth pastor didn't get it right, or you didn't get it right 2 years ago. I probably still don't have it all right now, but that's not a reason to throw it out. Still, look at these words and find out what it means for you to be a person who takes on oppression, who understands these things, who has been hurt, and doesn't give that hurt back on to people. And that's a lot harder than just, I hate to say it, but that's a lot harder than pretending like we are bringing the love of Jesus somewhere when we are just avoiding our own pain and suffering. When we follow a Jesus who went straight towards it. And on your way, yes, you meet people and you have these encounters. But I'm a firm believer that you can't give what you don't have. You can't invite someone to a table you don't think you have a seat in. You can't love someone better than you are able to love yourself. That's your capacity. So we want to be a part of these things. It's got to go inward first. And we have to be able to sit with a suffering Christ inside of us until we can love that part and see that part as good and divine and holy and a part of us. And that takes so much work. Those are very easy words to say, and I know that those are very hard things to do. But that is our work. Because once we can do that, then we can start to look at the world in a different way. And I don't know if you've looked around, but we need people who look at the world in a different way. We need people to stop becoming the things that hurt them. We need people to stop taking on oppression and giving it back. We need people to stop accumulating power for themselves because they felt powerless. We need people who are not waiting to see what happens after we die. Honestly, we need people who are right here, right now, trying to bring a kingdom of heaven that looks a little different. And that's my call to all of us this morning. is what would it look like to be able to find and love the nuance in ourselves? And if we could do that, can we find and love the nuance in our neighbor? And if we can do that, we can participate with these radical words of Jesus that allow us to find and love the nuance even in our enemy. And I believe at the end of that, the circle continues. And if you can love in that way, you'll start to love yourself better. And we'll create this beautiful, beautiful cycle. Does that sound good? Yeah? All right. I'm going to pray for us. God, thank you so much. Thank you for each and every story represented in this room, because each one of those stories tells a bigger narrative about who you are and what you can do. God, I'm sorry for all the places that we put you in a box, for all the small stories that have been handed out in this room. I'm sorry for all the hurts, all the oppression, all of the violence, all of the shame. And I ask that you would give each and every person in this room eyes to see and ears to hear where you might be transforming that pain, that shame, that oppression into something that can bring this kingdom narrative to our own lives and to the lives around us. Be with us as we search for healing, wholeness, and transformation, God. Be with one another, create communities, create relationships, find therapists, find spiritual directors, God, and allow us to continue to do this work together. In your son's name we pray. Amen.